Sylvester was born Sylvester James in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles in 1947. He got his musical start singing in church, and it's said that his knack for all things fabulous and beautiful came from his grandmother, who he adored and who embraced him and accepted him for who he was at a very young age. While his family accepted him, it was still out of the societal norm for a boy to be openly and unapologetically queer and feminine. In his teens, he would make his way up north to San Francisco, California. Historically, San Francisco and New York City were known as the original gay-friendly cities because they served as a safe haven for queer-identifying people. While there, he would join the Cockettes, a multiracial drag ensemble comprised of members of fluid genders and sexual orientations. Now today, when people think of drag, they typically think of performers lip-syncing in liquor catsuits. But during Sylvester's time, drag performance was a lot more live performance oriented. Drag reviews such as Sylvester and the Cockettes did choreography, sketch comedy routines, and live musical numbers. And it was in these musical numbers that Sylvester shined. The highlight of the Cockettes act was Sylvester's diva medley. The popularity of his act would lead him to pursue a solo career where he would put together his own band of straight white male musicians, calling themselves Sylvester and the Hot Band. The Hot Band would release 2 albums before disbanding, and a few years later, Sylvester would re-emerge as a solo artist, releasing his debut album, Sylvester. But it wouldn't be until his next release, Step 2, that he will finally become an international superstar. Until this point, Sylvester had been working as a singer for well over a decade, but struggled to reach a mainstream audience. With disco music at its peak, singles such as Dance Disco Heat and You Make Me Feel Mighty Real will push Sylvester not only to the top of the charts, but in front of a mass international audience. When he debuts, the general public isn't sure how to react because backing Sylvester were 2 big, beautiful plus-size women, Martha Wash and Izora Rhodes, who he dubbed the 2 Tons of Fun. Like Sylvester, Wash and Rhodes come from gospel backgrounds and the church. At this point in music, the listening public is familiar with the sounds of gospel, and they had somewhat of a working knowledge of queer men in music. However, queer men in music at this time would be the Village People or Freddie Mercury, men who were still masculine presenting in their appearance. So of course, Sylvester stands out because the public had never seen a man, most importantly a black man, that looked like that and sang like this. When you listen to Sylvester sing, the first thing you notice is that he sings purely in falsetto. This is in no way saying that Sylvester is the first man to sing in falsetto. In the 50s and 60s, the male falsetto singer was very popular in doo-wop music, But doo-wop was generally made of groups, and the falsetto singer was generally relegated to only singing the harmony. As far as black musicians are concerned, there's Eddie Kendricks and Philip Bailey, who both predate Sylvester in mainstream success. But the difference is, with those performers, they use falsetto as a demonstration of range. Kendricks and Bailey, the falsetto was not their primary singing voice, and they still recorded and performed songs in their natural voices. And you can't forget that all of these men presented and identified as straight heterosexual males. Sylvester, on the other hand, his entire look and musical persona was about being grand, being fab, being a diva. His presentation was outwardly feminine, and not to mention he sings in women's keys. So for him, singing in falsetto was another way to bend and defy gender norms. So the intent and implementation of how these singers use falsetto is completely different. As we established, Sylvester sings in falsetto, so let's actually understand how that works. In the voice, there are different registers. The first being modal register. Modal voice would be your chest voice and your head voice. Both of those registers use the main body of your vocal cords. So this diagram right here shows what your voice looks like when you're using modal voice and singing properly. See how everything is moving? Falsetto, on the other hand, is produced by the edges of the vocal cords. So in this diagram, you see how only the edges are touching? There isn't much movement, and there's very minimal vibration. And singing on the edges of the chords means that the vocal cords are stretched even longer and thinner. So you'll notice with Sylvester and other men who sing in falsetto, it sounds like their voices can break or crack at any minute. Many voice teachers don't encourage singers to sing purely in falsetto, mainly due to the lack of tone, quality, and color. This is not saying that trained and classical singers don't use falsetto. Falsetto is coordinated into the head voice, and a well-developed voice will use falsetto to blend and transition between registers. So let's hear an example. Falsetto and head voice typically live on the oo and e vowel sounds. So on the word news, she incorporates falsetto to go from her middle to upper register. And when she says 2 by 2, she uses it again to go from her middle to upper register. Think of falsetto as salt for your food. If you use a little bit of salt, it can make your food taste so much better. It can bring out all the deliciousness and beauty of the flavors. But if you use too much salt or falsetto, you won't be able to notice the real meat of the meal, or in this case, the sound of your voice. Because Sylvester uses so much falsetto, we don't really have a good sense of what his natural voice sounds like. Step 2 was a huge international success, and even earned him the title the King and Queen of Disco. He will follow it up with the release of another hit album, Stars, which will feature disco hits such as Can't Stop Dancing and the genre-defying I Need Somebody to Love Tonight. A record that is so ahead of its time that to this day, people are still unsure of whether it qualifies as techno, disco, EDM, or house music. Sylvester's string of success will culminate in him making history when he performed with the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra at the coveted War Memorial Opera House. The night will be captured and released on his album Living Proof. This album is important because it not only showcases Sylvester's uncanny ability to move an audience, but it also shows how his voice works and functions. One of the highlights of this album is Dance Disco Heat. Dance with me in the disco heat. Dance with me in the disco heat. Similar to other performances of this tune, Martha, Izora, and Sylvester started off singing together. And you can see that he's getting overpowered by the two women. And this is because he's singing in the pure falsetto. Midway through, he speaks and tells the audience to get up and dance.
How many times did you say dance? But will you tell me what the hell you're sitting on your asses for?
Now, you notice how clear you can understand it.
How many times did you say dance? But will you tell me what the hell you're sitting on your asses for?
In a 1982 interview, operatic soprano Grace Bumbry says that the singing voice and the speaking voice sit in two different places. To go from one to the other throughout a whole evening is impossible. Like a house, you build a voice from the bottom up. The power, the clarity, the color, the tone of your voice comes from the chest voice. You speak in a chest voice, so when he speaks, there is a power and there is a clarity.
How many times did you say dance? You said a lot of times, didn't you? But will you tell me what the hell you're sitting on your asses for?
But when he sings in the pure falsetto, not only does the power disappear, but the clarity in the speech does also. You'll notice throughout much of Sylvester's catalog, his diction is not always the clearest. For example, many singers have talked about the challenges of clearly articulating words when singing at the top of their range. Remember, Sylvester sings in women's keys, so he's singing an octave above where his natural voice sits. So everything he's singing is a high note. And then you add on top of that, there is no chest voice in his sound. Both of these things compromise the diction. Towards the end of the song, Sylvester sings a series of low B flats.
She didn't know I could do that, did you?
Similar to when he's speaking, because he's in his natural voice or his chest voice, you can clearly understand that he's saying. Critically, Living Proof is considered Sylvester's crowning achievement, but it didn't match the commercial success of his predecessors because it was released at the top of the disco backlash movement.
Teens were at White Sox Park for a radio station promotion called Anti-Disco. A local disc jockey blew up disco records in center field, and a crowd responded by rushing the field.
The disco backlash movement of 1979 transformed disco from a socially acceptable form of music and culture to one that was highly stigmatized. But It must be mentioned that the backlash of disco was not just at the musical genre, but at the identities and the people linked to disco culture, particularly people who identified as queer.
Year-old says disco's over.
Oh, I wouldn't say that. People are still out every night, lines and people still dancing, so I don't think it's dead at all. It's just changed.
Like many artists who had their success in disco, Sylvester too would struggle to find a new musical identity and sound. So in an effort to find new musical footing, he would release Too Hot to Sleep. This album is notable because he sings a great deal of it in his natural voice.
I know the devil gonna keep from you. And if you're
So taking songs such as Thinking Right into account, we can hear that he has a very easy low B flat, and that the actual center of his voice, his natural voice, is in the third octave. This would be an indicator that his true voice is that of a baritone. The attempt to change or do things that could be perceived more as masculine to appeal to more people wasn't unfamiliar to Sylvester. In fact, his first solo record, Sylvester was presented as your typical 70 males R&B singer. But let the record show that all of his success came from him being himself. And he would go back to being himself on his follow-up album, Do You Wanna Funk?
Do you wanna funk? Won't you tell me now?
The title track alone is credited with birthing what will become known as the high energy music genre. This record would be released at the top of the AIDS epidemic and would coincide with him entering a relationship with his eventual longtime partner, Rick Kramer. In the mid-80s, Kramer would learn that he was HIV positive. Realizing that he was more than likely infected, Sylvester refused to have his blood tested, but he did continue to work and release music.
Such a better box.
There is a very strong chance that Sylvester was sick when he recorded and released his last two records. And when you listen to these last two records, there isn't too much change in the voice. Something I did not mention is that Sylvester was a cigarette smoker. And generally, it takes about 15 or so years for cigarette damage to become audible. But we should also note that cigarette damage will be heard first in the speaking voice or the chest voice. Sylvester does not sing in a natural or chest voice, so it's very hard to differentiate if there is any cigarette damage on his voice at this point in time. He continued to perform until he was physically unable to. In December of 1988, he succumbed to AIDS at the age of 41. You know, sometimes when you are the first, you can be forgotten. Today, we have the likes of RuPaul, Billy Porter, Lil Nas X, and Saucy Santana. They all often talk about representation and trying to make space for black queer men in music and entertainment. But wearing a dress, Sylvester did that. Wearing makeup, Sylvester did that.
What did you say to your when your family found out you were going to be a drag queen? That you are?
I'm not a drag queen.
Well, you are
I'm
sometimes.
Sylvester.
Blurring the lines of gender, Sylvester did that. Crossing over and being accepted by black, white, and all races in between, Sylvester did that. I mean, come on now. He's the blueprint and the shoulders that many queer, not just black, but queer men, period, stand upon, whether they know it or not. Say his name, give him his flowers, because he paved the way. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. And as always, until next time.